Why are the Americans helping us? That question passed from bunk to bunk, from one row of straw pallets to the next, from the men with hollow cheeks to the men still trying to stand straight out of habit, from the skeptics to frightened, and from the frightened to the ashamed. And in the final weeks of the war, it became the single question that changed everything inside a former German prison compound west of the collapsing Reich, a place of timber barracks, ditches, wire, watchtowers, soot-darkened stoves, and ground so churned by boots and carts that it had stopped looking like earth and started looking like some exhausted substance produced by the war itself. It was not one of the great infamous centers of extermination that the world would soon come to know in horror, but it was still a harsh enclosure built by a brutal system, a military holding camp made for control rather than mercy. And by the spring of 1945, it had become a waiting room for defeat, filled now not with foreign captives but with German prisoners of war gathered up from broken units, collapsed fronts, abandoned roads, and the wreckage of a country whose promises had run out before its suffering did. Behind that wire stood a cross-section of a dying army and a dying illusion. There were boys who had been issued uniforms before their faces had even settled into manhood, older reservists with wives and children somewhere beyond the smoke, mechanics, clerks, farmhands, signalers, truck drivers, artillerymen separated from their guns, infantrymen separated from their officers, fanatics who still muttered about miraculous reversals, doubters who had stopped believing long ago, and silent men who no longer had the strength to say what they believed at all. Whatever had divided them outside the camp, class, rank, region, conviction, bravado, guilt, blurred behind a wire into one common condition: uncertainty sharpened by fear. For years they had lived beneath a storm of propaganda that painted every enemy in convenient colors. The Soviets have been described as vengeance made flesh, the British as hypocrites with polite voices and iron hearts, and the Americans as a strange contradiction, soft in comfort, rich in material, smiling in photographs, but dangerous in victory, the sort of enemy who might hand out cigarettes with one hand and humiliation with the other. They had been told that once Germany fell, there would be no restraint, no fairness, no distinction between soldier and symbol. The victors will remember the bombed cities, the murdered civilians, the ruin across Europe, the graves filled on too many fronts, and they would answer it all not with law but with revenge. Such lessons have been repeated in barracks, newspapers, training grounds, speeches, and field sermons until fear no longer needed proof. Fear had become a reflex. It rose before facts. It interpreted shadows. It listened at doors. By the time the prisoners found themselves inside that camp in the last grinding weeks of the war, many expected that capture would not be the end of danger, but the beginning of a slower, more humiliating kind of destruction. They watched the horizon and listened for engines. They heard distant artillery, like doors slamming somewhere beyond the world they still knew. They watched smoke stand over roads and villages. They counted rumors the way starving men count crumbs. The Americans had crossed another river. The Americans had taken another town. The Americans were close. The Americans were already on the road. The Americans were at the gate. No one knew which rumor was true, but everyone knew the larger truth beneath them all. The war in the West was lost. That recognition did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It came like thawed water beneath ice, loosening everything from below. Supply trucks stopped coming. Orders came later and contradicted each other. Officers who had once spoken with polished certainty now avoided questions or vanished altogether. The camp itself seemed to sense what was happening. Guards grew tense. Inventories became chaotic. The kitchens were short on everything. The infirmary smelled of iodine, damp wool, stale breath, and infection. Lice spread. Coughing spread. Dysentery spread. In the mornings, the men lined up for watery soup and dark bread that seemed to shrink each week. And while they stood in line, they studied the towers, the gates, the road, and each other, asking the same questions without words. What will happen to us? How bad will it be? How long do we have? Then the front broke, so quickly that the camp changed hands almost in a day. There was no grand battle at the wire, no last stand worthy of propaganda posters, no heroic tableau arranged for history. There was confusion, withdrawal, hurried instructions, the sound of trucks moving out, a burst of fire somewhere beyond the trees, and then the sudden arrival of American troops, muddy-armed, alert, moving fast but not wildly, the kind of men who had been advancing for months through villages, forests, crossroads, hedgerows, frozen roads, and shattered towns. The kind of men who no longer wasted energy on dramatics because they had already seen too much of war to decorate it. They entered the compound in squads, checked the towers, secured the gates, posted guards, inspected the cookhouse, inspected the pumps, inspected the storerooms, inspected the infirmary, counted the prisoners, counted the blankets, counted the dead who had not yet been properly accounted for. And in those first hours, everything they did was misread. When they ordered the sickest barracks emptied, the prisoners thought the weak were being separated for disappearance. When medics arrived with masks, gloves, powder, stretchers, and disinfectant, the prisoners thought experiments or punishment had begun. When American guards shouted for everyone to strip bedding out into the yard, resistance flickered in tired eyes because men believed their last possessions were being destroyed out of spite. When the first pile of infested straw mattresses was set alight, smoke rolled across the compound, and panic moved almost faster than the fire itself. Some were certain the Americans meant to burn them out. Others whispered that the next step would be to burn the barracks. Even the rationing felt sinister. Starving men expected either immediate abundance or deliberate starvation. Instead, they received measured ladles, counted slices, careful instructions, and sharp refusals when some tried to seize more. To prisoners already trained by fear, restraint looked like cruelty. Only slowly did the truth begin to emerge. The Americans were not burning bedding for sport, but to stop the lice and disease that had spread through the camp. The weakest men were not disappearing, but being moved into isolated rooms for treatment because the infirmary, such as it was, could no longer hold them safely. The careful portions were not punishment but precaution, because too much food too fast could kill men already hollowed out by hunger. The orders, the inspections, the shouted commands, the rough efficiency of it all. These were not the first stage of revenge. They were triage. The Americans had not come to make the camp gentler in any sentimental sense. They had come to keep it from collapsing into a graveyard. Still, belief did not change in a day. The lie had been told for too many years. The truth arrived wearing the face of suspicion. The prisoners watched every gesture for hidden intent. If an American guard shared a cigarette, some took it and some refused it, convinced that no kindness from an enemy could be clean. If a medic cleaned a wound, the patient looked for the trick in the bandage. If a translator tried to explain the need for quarantine, some nodded and others stared at him as if he had crossed a moral frontier simply by believing the explanation. The Americans themselves did not help matters by looking like the victors the prisoners had feared. They carried better gear, warmer jackets, cleaner canteens, heavier boots, and the confidence of men whose supply system still functioned. Their trucks smelled of fuel, coffee, canvas, and canned food. Their engineers brought tools. Their medics brought crates. Their quartermasters brought ledgers. There was wealth in those columns, material wealth, procedural wealth, the wealth of an army still coherent at the end of a continent-wide war. To men from a collapsing state, such order could feel almost insulting. Yet alongside that order came something the prisoners had not expected at all: restraint. The Americans searched them. Yes, they took knives, maps, insignia that needed to be cataloged, and anything that might be used in violence. They posted guards with loaded rifles. They barked when they had to. Some were impatient. Some were suspicious. Some were simply tired enough to sound harsh, even when they meant no harm. But there was no parade of beatings, no spectacle of humiliation, no ritual of revenge. Men were counted, sorted, treated, and fed. The camp was cleaned. The latrines were dug deeper and limed. The pumps were repaired. Ventilation boards were pried open where the barracks had become fever boxes. The infirmary was reorganized. Pots were scrubbed. A burial detail was formed so that the dead, even the nameless dead, would not remain where they had fallen. It was not mercy in the language of tenderness. It was mercy in the language of work. It smelled not of sentiment, but of soap, smoke, hot metal, damp wood, and disinfectant. The first real break in the prisoners' fear came not from words, but from the road outside the wire. For several days after the Americans took the compound, the area beyond the camp filled with movement. Liberated foreign laborers, displaced civilians, local women with drawn faces and baskets, men in patched coats, children staring at columns, and the occasional knot of people with more than curiosity in their eyes. The prisoners learned quickly that not everyone outside the wire wanted them preserved. There were shouts in several languages. There were curses. There were gestures that needed no translation. There were stones lifted, though not all were thrown. The Americans, without ceremony, formed a line between the crowd and the fence. They did not do it dramatically. They simply did it because that too was part of taking control. Rifles stayed ready. Voices stayed hard. And the message was unmistakable. No one was getting through. Not to harm the prisoners and not to provoke a bloodbath. Only then did some of the Germans understand that the wire was no longer keeping them only in a strange, bitter, almost impossible way. It was also keeping vengeance out. That realization settled uneasily in the barracks. The same soldiers who guarded them were also protecting them. The same men whose arrival had been imagined as catastrophe were now standing between them and the accumulated hatred of a ravaged continent. But even that was not enough to completely erase suspicion. What changed the camp forever came at night, and it came in flame. No one later agreed on the first cause. Some blamed a cracked iron stove in an overcrowded hut. Others said old timber, dry straw, and neglected wiring made a disaster inevitable, and only the hour was uncertain. A few insisted an ember from a cook fire had blown under a wall. Whatever the source, the result was the same. One of the central barracks caught, and once it caught, the fire moved with the speed of dry wood remembering summer. Men woke to smoke before they woke to sense. Someone shouted. Someone kicked at a bunk frame. Someone fell from an upper pallet. The ceiling glowed. Straw began spitting sparks. In a matter of moments, the barrack had become a chamber of heat and confusion. And because fear had already trained the prisoners to expect the worst, many believed in that first blind terror that this was the moment the Americans would stand back and let fate finish its work. Why would they risk themselves for enemy prisoners now? Why would men who had crossed battlefields, lost friends, and advanced through ruins rush into a burning hut to save the uniforms they had been fighting only days or weeks earlier? Why would they lose sleep, blood, or breath for Germans? That question lasted only seconds because the Americans were already running toward the fire. They came from the guard line, from the cookhouse, from the medical room, from the outer yard. Some had axes, some had crowbars, some had blankets, some had stretchers. Some came with buckets because there was nothing else to carry. They tore at jammed doors. They smashed out sections of wall where smoke had trapped the men closest to collapse. They shouted for water. They shouted for medics. They shouted for room. They dragged the half-conscious into the mud. They formed a bucket line under a sky lit orange by a roof beginning to fail. They ripped away burning straw with gloved hands, and sometimes with bare hands when gloves were too slow. They cut through sections of wire fence to create a wider route for evacuation because the main access had become a choking bottleneck of shouting men and flying sparks. The prisoners outside the flames saw a shape stumbling out blackened with soot, coughing, blind with tears, some wrapped in blankets by the very soldiers they had feared. They saw medics kneel in mud to open airways, press bandages, check pulses. They saw guards go back and more than once. They saw Americans emerge carrying men over shoulders, under arms, in pairs, by wrists. Any way the living could be separated from the fire before the roof gave way. They saw one of the American water details knocked down by a collapsing section of wall, and another group pulling them out and going right back to the line. They saw the flames climb, and yet the rescue continue. They saw no sorting by rank, no sorting by ideology, no sorting by who had once believed most deeply in the cause that had brought Europe to ruin. The Americans saved whoever they could reach. A man with SS runes scratched from his uniform was dragged out next to a conscript who had barely learned to shave. An older reservist was laid beside a teenage signals runner. Hands blistered by rescue work passed canteens at enemy mouths. Blankets were thrown over enemy shoulders. Bandages were wound around enemy skin. When the fire was finally controlled, after what felt inside the camp like a whole lifetime compressed into one wind-torn hour, one barrack stood charred and half-collapsed. Several more were scorched, and the yard was filled with coughing men, medics, ash, steam, splintered timber, broken bed frames, overturned buckets, and the strange, stunned silence that follows catastrophe when everyone is too exhausted to decide yet what it means. Then the Americans did something that broke the old fear more deeply than the rescue itself. The prisoners whose barack had burned could not remain outside in the cold, and there was not enough intact space to house them all comfortably. So the Americans gave up part of their own. Supply corners were cleared. Tents went up. Storage sheds were emptied. Guard spaces were narrowed. Extra blankets appeared from piles no prisoner had known existed. Through the rest of that night and into the freezing early morning, German prisoners who had expected at best indifference and at worst deliberate neglect found themselves under American canvas, wrapped in American blankets, drinking hot liquid from American field containers while American medics checked their lungs and burns. No lecture could have done what that night did. No poster could have undone years of propaganda the way the sight of enemy soldiers carrying enemy prisoners out of a burning barack did. In the days after the fire, the atmosphere in the camp changed in a way that no one could miss. Suspicion did not vanish all at once, but it stopped ruling everything. The prisoners began to watch the Americans differently. They noticed things that had been invisible before, because fear had interpreted every act in the darkest possible way. They noticed the care with which the sick were separated, so that fever would not run unchecked through the barracks. They noticed that the Americans kept records, who had been moved, who had died, who needed dressings changed, who had eaten, who had not. They noticed that the men serving food did not keep the strongest portions to themselves, but often sent the thickest ladles to those on the medical list. They noticed an engineered detail repairing roof planks and pump handles, instead of simply posting another order and letting the prisoners rot in wet quarters. They noticed a guard give a part of his own coffee ration to the infirmary, because the men with burns could keep little else down. They noticed that when an older prisoner collapsed in the line from dizziness, 2 Americans lifted him before some of his own countrymen had even moved, not because the prisoners were cruel, but because war and hunger had made reaction itself slow and selfish. They noticed small things. A crate dragged across mud, so the weakest could sit while waiting for treatment. A pair of dry socks tossed without flourish to a man whose feet were too raw for boots. A translator recruited not to interrogate, but to explain why the camp needed to be deloused, why clothing had to be boiled, why men with certain symptoms had to sleep apart, why the pump must be used in order, why grabbing extra food would only collapse the whole distribution. The pattern was unmistakable once seen. The Americans were not interested in sentimental friendship. They were interested in keeping human beings alive in a place already too accustomed to watching them weaken. The next test came from the sky and the fields beyond the camp, because the front, though shattered, had not vanished. Even in those final days, the war still had enough motion left in it to kill carelessly. One gray afternoon, when the air had that wet metallic smell that promised more cold before spring, distant shell fire began walking closer to the road network near the camp. Whether it came from a broken German battery firing blindly to cover retreat or from some confused exchange farther off, hardly mattered to men under the blasts. What mattered was that fragments began to strike near enough to throw dirt over the wire and crack timber on one of the outer structures. Trucks in the yard were moved at once. Americans shouted for everyone to get down. Some prisoners, slow from hunger and habit, stood frozen in the fatal stillness that often follows a shouted order when the mind is too crowded by old fear to obey new logic. The Americans did not leave them there. Guards vaulted ditches, pulled men flat, shoved them toward trench lines, dragged the slowest by sleeves and belts, and covered the exposed with their own bodies until the nearest burst past. Later, when the shelling had moved away and only the smell of fresh earth and smoke remained, the prisoners learned that some of the American troops had been cut by fragments while hauling Germans into cover. Again, there had been no sorting, no calculation of worth, only action. Again, the prisoners were forced to confront the same impossible fact. The men they had been taught to imagine as vindictive had just risked injury to protect them from fire coming from the side that had once been their own. War in those days began to feel stranger than propaganda had ever allowed. A harder, quieter truth entered the barracks after that. The Americans were not saints. The prisoners could see that. They were tired men, many of them unshaven, mud-caked, short-tempered from long marches and interrupted sleep. Some spoke with clipped impatience. Some had the hard eyes of men who had buried friends in places whose names the prisoners only half knew: Normandy, the Ardennes, the Hurtgen, river crossings, villages fought over house by house. They were not free of anger. They were not above cursing. When a prisoner lied, stole, or tried to provoke trouble, punishment followed quickly. There were searches, shouted reprimands, orders delivered without softness. Yet that complexity only made their behavior harder to dismiss. These were not gentle dreamers unmarked by war. They were soldiers who had every practical excuse to harden themselves completely, and yet the pattern remained. They did not descend into revenge. The camp continued to change under their control. Boiling vats were set up to disinfect clothing. Hair was cut where lice had become unmanageable. The prisoners hated it at first. To be shaved, dusted with powder, stripped, searched, and issued clean garments felt humiliating. But after a few days of scratching eased, the coughing barracks stopped worsening at the same pace, and the medical line shortened. Water, once muddy and intermittent, ran more reliably after the pumps were overhauled. The cookhouse, smoky and foul when the Americans first inspected it, was reorganized with astonishing speed. Broken ladles were replaced. Fuel was rationed properly. Pot order mattered. Fire order mattered. American quartermasters and kitchen troops, assisted now by selected prisoner work details, began turning limited stores into something approaching regular meals. The soup was still thin some days and the bread still measured, but chaos retreated. In a place where chaos had once been the primary authority, that mattered. Then came the work details, and with them the first fragile form of trust. At first the prisoners assumed labor assignment meant exploitation or humiliation. They had been conditioned to think power must always be used to break. Instead, the tasks were ugly but necessary: hauling salvage from the burned barrack, digging drainage ditches, mending fence posts, carrying lime for latrines, stacking timber, repairing roof panels, unloading medical supplies, clearing paths through mud, and later helping establish a more orderly infirmary annex in a less crowded structure. Under guard, yes. Under instruction, yes. But not as spectacle and not in starvation conditions. The Americans needed the camp made livable, and the prisoners were the labor available to help do it. In that shared work, without any declaration that it was important, something shifted again. Men on both sides of the guard line began to see each other in motion rather than in myth. The prisoners saw Americans slipping in the same mud, cursing the same broken wheelbarrows, carrying the same water, getting drenched by the same rain, scratching at the same smoke in their throats after long hours near the cook fires. The Americans saw prisoners not only as a mass in field-gray uniforms, but as exhausted individuals within a crowd, some obedient, some bitter, some frightened, some eager to help if it meant a cleaner blanket or a warmer corner, some too weak even then to lift more than one end of the plank. Language remained a barrier, but work has its own grammar. A lifted hand could mean weight. A flat palm could mean steady. 2 fingers could send for more nails. A nod could acknowledge effort without pretending friendship where none yet existed. In the yard and repair zones, the prisoners also overheard things they had not expected. Americans spoke not only of advancing and winning, but of home. They spoke of farms, factories, train depots, mothers who wrote too often or too little, wives carrying households alone, younger brothers somewhere in uniform, rationing back home, baseball scores months out of date, socks that never stayed dry, buddies lost on roads no one wanted to name twice. The prisoners, who had been taught to think of the Americans as mechanical representatives of wealth and power, began to hear the ordinary human weariness beneath the uniforms. They heard grief in those conversations. They heard boredom, gallows humor, longing, irritation, tenderness, and the small practical anxieties of men trying to finish a war without being killed in its final useless days. That did not erase difference. It did not equalize guilt. It simply made hatred harder to keep simple. The turning point in emotion came not from a single speech, but from accumulation. A prisoner from the burn barrack survived because American medics changed dressings day after day until the danger of infection passed. Another with pneumonia survived because he had been moved to the infirmary when the first American inspection found him barely conscious in a lower bunk. Men who would have died of dehydration weeks earlier now lived because the water system ran, and the sick were monitored. The burial detail found that the dead were recorded more carefully than before. Where names could be matched, they were matched. Where they could not, the dead were still covered, carried, and placed with order. For the living, even that mattered. In war, the way the dead are handled teaches the living what they are worth. Spring advanced in reluctant stages. First the mud changed texture. Then the mornings lost some of their knife-edge cold. Then a few birds returned to the wire, careless of flags and uniforms. The prisoners noticed these things more now because survival had become imaginable. Hunger still gnawed, but not with the same daily certainty of collapse. Disease still haunted the camp, but now there were routines against it. There were inspections, watch rotations, medical calls, and food lines that functioned. There was work. There was order. There was the beginning of the dangerous feeling called tomorrow. With that came more difficult thoughts. Some of the prisoners had spent the first days under American control occupied entirely by their own fear. As that fear loosened, other recognitions entered. They could not avoid the state of the country around them. Through gaps in the routine, through fragments of news, through the road traffic outside the camp, through the faces of displaced persons, through the stories that came in with guards and interpreters, they began to understand more fully that Germany had not merely lost a war. It had dragged half the continent through a nightmare. Even those who had known enough to suspect it before now had no easy refuge in denial. Mercy from the Americans did not make those facts smaller. In some ways it made them hard to bear, because decency shown by an enemy cast a different light on the lies one's own side told. Shame entered the camp beside relief. For some men it came quietly. For others it came like nausea. No one announced it. It lived in the longer silences after evening soup, in the way eyes drop when convoys of freed laborers pass a road, in the way certain slogans disappear from speech, in the way the old certainties suddenly sounded childish or monstrous when repeated out loud. Yet even then the Americans did not turn the camp into a theater of moral instruction. They had too much to do. A war was still ending. Roads needed securing. Prisoners needed counting, treating, feeding, and moving. Supplies needed tracking. The astonishing thing, from the prisoner's point of view, was precisely that the Americans seemed able to do what needed doing without first staging hatred. That pattern reached one of its quietest and deepest expressions on a cold Sunday near the end of the fighting in the West. By then the camp had been stabilized enough that a simple religious service was permitted in the yard near the less damaged barracks. There was no grand altar, no choir assembled for effect, no speech from a victorious general. There were merely men, some wearing crosses under uniforms, some who had not prayed in years, some who stood because standing together felt better than staying alone with their thoughts, and there were chaplains and interpreters and the wind moving lightly over the wire. A few hymns were attempted in hesitant, broken cooperation. The languages did not match, but the shape of the music did. For a brief time the camp heard voices rising not to command, argue, or curse, but to remember something older than the war and perhaps stronger than it. Prisoners who had marched under one flag and guards who wore another did not become equals in that moment, nor friends, nor absolved men, but they stood in the same air and acknowledged the same dead and the same need for an end. Some wept, not loudly. War rarely allows the luxury of theatrical grief, but enough to be seen, enough to be remembered. Then came the news everyone had expected, and no one quite knew how to receive. Germany surrendered. The announcement did not explode inside the camp in one unified emotion, because there was no single emotion left to have. Some prisoners sagged with relief so visible it seemed to remove years from their faces in seconds. Some stood motionless, staring at nothing, because surrender was a word too large to fit into the lives waiting for it. Some felt humiliation, some numbness, some gratitude simply to hear that the long machinery of destruction was stopping. There was no romantic scene at the wire, no sudden embrace of enemies, no music from hidden speakers, no easy final lesson. The Americans marked the news with professionalism more than celebration. For them, too, victory was complicated. They had won, yes, but many had also lost friends, homes, time, innocence, parts of themselves that would not return. A few smiled openly. A few sat down as if their bodies had only just now received permission to feel tired. Orders still needed carrying out. The camp still needed running. The prisoners still needed feeding. One of the strangest discoveries of Germans in those days was that the war could end and the Americans would still continue doing the same unglamorous things that had already changed the compound. Checking the sick, measuring rations, supervising work details, preventing outbreaks, settling disputes, protecting the prisoners from external violence, and preserving a system within which men might survive long enough to be released into whatever future remained. The surrender did, however, bring some visible changes. The tension in the perimeter eased. The shelling in the distance faded. More supplies arrived. Newsprint circulated. Lists began to matter more. Lists of names, lists of transfers, lists of those fit to work, those fit to travel, those requiring longer medical observation. The prisoners were allowed, in controlled stages, to send brief messages home or to write names and addresses for later contact. For men who had spent months or years inside battlefront time, the simple act of writing to the living felt almost miraculous. Hands shook over pencils. Some had no words. Some had too many and were permitted too few. Yet, the chance itself mattered. It was one more sign that they were being handled not as a faceless burden, but as human beings moving, however slowly, back toward civilian life. Not every day was noble. That would be a lie of a different sort. There were quarrels in the lines. There were thefts of food. There were men too hardened or frightened to trust any system at all. There were guards who snapped. There were prisoners who clung to resentment because admitting error hurt more than clinging to hatred. There were nights of coughing, days of rain, shortages, delays, sicknesses that treatment could not reverse, and funerals that did not stop just because surrender had been signed. Several who had survived the fire later died from complications. Others who had held on through months of collapse were simply too far gone by the time stable food and care reached them. The camp remained a place marked by loss. Yet even that truth sharpened the mercy rather than diminishing it. The Americans were not presiding over a fantasy. They were working amid damage, already done. Their decency was real precisely because it took place in mud, shortage, infection, grief, and exhaustion, not outside those things, but inside them. As the weeks went on, prisoner work parties were increasingly used for reconstruction tasks beyond immediate barracks, repairing approach roads, clearing debris from nearby storage areas, unloading relief goods, restoring drainage, and in some cases assisting with simple agricultural labor in surrounding districts under supervision, because a broken country still had to eat. These tasks placed German prisoners in situations that further unsettled the old propaganda. They saw Americans helping civilians as readily as they helped prisoners. They saw them distribute food to children, share medicine with old women, and stop looting where they found it. They saw sternness, certainly, but not the indiscriminate brutality they had been told would define occupation. Sometimes they even saw American troops refuse favors from locals or turn away offered gifts because procedure required neutrality. Such things were noted and repeated back inside the camp, where rumor still functioned as a form of weather. One day a work detail returned with a story that Americans had spent hours repairing a town well before unloading their own supplies. Another reported that a guard had broken up a fight not between Americans and Germans, but among Germans over bread, then made sure the older man at the center of it still received his full portion. Another told an American medic who treated a villager's infected foot on the roadside with the same focused attention he gave prisoners. These stories spread not because they were grand, but because they were consistent. They fit the new pattern. Slowly, what the prisoners said of the Americans changed. At first, they had spoken of them as a category. The enemy, the captors, the victors. Later, they began to distinguish the medics, the cooks, the engineers, the translator with the damaged glove, the guard detail from the night of the fire, the truck team that always arrived with more lumber than seemed possible. They still did not know many names, and often names were not exchanged at all. But the faceless category had broken apart into recognizable kinds of men doing recognizable kinds of work. Hatred had to compete now with memory, and memory is often more stubborn. One evening, long after the fire but before the camp began to empty in earnest, an American crate of clothing was opened for redistribution. Out came mismatched garments, boots of different sizes, shirts, wool items, and odds and ends gathered from supply lines. It was a practical scene, almost comic in its disorder. But to the prisoners it represented something larger. Their own uniforms were failing. Many were burned, lice-ridden, torn, or too thin for another season. The Americans issued what could be issued, not because the prisoners had earned favor, but because no authority worthy of the name would leave men in unusable rags when replacements existed. To be given clothing by the enemy was a small indignity to pride, perhaps, but a large affirmation to life. Men who had expected only confiscation now received boots. Men who had expected only commands now received blankets. The contrast between expectation and reality became the defining memory of the camp. Some admitted it openly. Others only let show in the way they no longer flinched from every approach of an American guard. The decisive change came when the prisoners began to help preserve the order that had preserved them. This was not collaboration in the ideological sense, nor conversion to any foreign cause. It was simpler and more human. They started policing the lines themselves, stopping weaker men from being crushed in the rush to soup. They helped carry the sick to medical call instead of leaving them until guards intervened. Barak elders, where such unofficial roles existed, began insisting on cleaner sleeping spaces because they had seen what the Americans had been fighting when they burned the bedding and dusted the rooms. Men volunteered for repair details because keeping the roofs sound now meant keeping one another dry. They had learned, through experience, that order need not always be a weapon. Sometimes it was simply the shape survival took. With that came the final emotional reversal. The prisoners no longer feared American kindness as a disguised cruelty. They began to fear instead what would have become of them without it. That thought appeared in fragments at first. A look toward the burned barrack, a silence outside the infirmary, a muttered line after the burial detail returned, a man staring at his bandaged hand and not saying anything for several minutes. But by then the question that had once moved through the barracks in disbelief had changed its meaning. Why are the Americans helping us? Was no longer asked as an accusation. It was asked as astonishment. The answer was never written on a sign. It was never delivered in a neat speech. The answer existed in action after action until explanation became unnecessary. They were helping because the war was ending and they had decided not to let victory rot into vengeance. They were helping because discipline for them included mercy. They were helping because many of them had seen enough death to know that adding unnecessary suffering to a defeated man does not honor the dead. They were helping because, whether from character, training, faith, exhaustion, or some combination of all four, they still believed that the defeated could be guarded without being degraded. They were helping because strength gave them the option of cruelty, and they chose not to exercise it. Some months later, when the camp had become less emergency ward than transit point, the gates began opening not in panic, but in paperwork. Releases came in stages. Transfers came in groups. The sickest remained longest. The strongest often went first to labor or clearing assignments under supervision before being sent onward. The process was slow enough to frustrate and orderly enough to feel unreal, compared with the collapse that had preceded it. Men stepped out carrying little. Perhaps a blanket roll, perhaps a few letters, perhaps bandaged hands, perhaps an extra piece of bread tucked away, perhaps a memory too large to name. For many, the world beyond the gate was not a happy one in any easy sense. Germany lay wrecked. Homes were gone or uncertain. Families were scattered. Shame traveled with relief. But they walked out alive, and many knew with uncomfortable clarity that they owed that fact in part to the enemy they had feared. Some paused at the gate. Some did not look back. Others turned briefly toward the yard, the repaired pump, the salvage barracks, the infirmary annex, the place where the burned structure had once stood, the wire that had first meant confinement, and then, unexpectedly, protection. Years later, when former prisoners tried to explain those weeks to wives, children, neighbors, or anyone who still wanted to hear war stories, they often found that the hardest thing to describe was not the hunger or the cold or the fire or even the surrender. Those things belonged, however terribly, to the known language of war. The hardest thing to describe was a collision between what they had been taught and what they had lived. They had expected revenge and found restraint. They had expected humiliation and found order. They had expected neglect and found medics, engineers, cooks, guards, and labor details all working, sometimes bluntly and sometimes kindly, toward the same plain objective: keep these men alive. In memory, certain images endured more than dates. A bucket line under a burning roof. American hands black with soot pulling Germans through smoke. A line of guards keeping an angry crowd back from the fence. A field medic kneeling in mud over an enemy prisoner, as if nationality were irrelevant to a pulse. A ration line becoming orderly because enough people now believe fairness would actually be enforced. A hymn half sung in 2 languages. A pair of boots tossed across a yard to a man whose own had become scraps. A letter started with shaking fingers because the chance to write home had returned. These were not the grand events of textbooks. No map would mark them. No campaign arrow would show them. But for those who lived inside that former prison compound, they were the events that redefined the war. History is often told through victories won and territories taken, but the moral shape of an era is sometimes revealed in smaller decisions, in whether a guard strikes or steadies, in whether a medic turned away or kneels, in whether a victorious army sees a defeated enemy only as an object of justified hatred or still, somehow, as a human responsibility. Inside that camp, the Americans had every practical means to be harsher than they were. The Germans knew that, and the knowledge sharpened the gratitude. Kindness freely chosen under conditions of total superiority is remembered differently than kindness exchanged between equals. It remains lodged in the mind. It unsettles old certainties. It demands that people retell themselves more honestly. That is why the memory followed the former prisoners long after the war. It was not simply that they had survived. It was that survival had arrived by a route propaganda had declared impossible. The enemy had not behaved as promised. The enemy had behaved better than promised. And in war, that difference can feel almost supernatural. Yet there was nothing supernatural about it. There were only choices made by ordinary men under extraordinary strain. Some American soldiers in that camp surely never thought of themselves as moral examples. They were doing jobs, guarding, counting, cooking, carrying, digging, treating, repairing. But history is full of moments when decency survives precisely in such unadorned labor. No speeches, no philosophy, no claim to purity. Just one practical act after another, all of them refusing the easier corruption of revenge. The prisoners, for their part, were not transformed into saints by receiving mercy. They remained what war and ideology and defeat had made them. Complicated men, compromised men, frightened men, men who would spend years deciding what parts of the old world inside themselves had to die with the Reich, and what parts could still be carried into whatever came next. But many crossed that threshold with one truth, secured beyond argument. They had waited for monsters. They had met men. That truth became, for some, the first honest foundation of peace. Not a piece of forgetting, because nothing about that war deserved easy forgetting, but a piece of recognition. Recognition that propaganda had lied. Recognition that victory need not feed on cruelty. Recognition that mercy shown to the defeated is not weakness, but strength under discipline. Recognition that even in the filth and smoke of the 20th century's darkest years, one group of armed men could still refuse to answer fear with humiliation and hatred with hatred. If there was a happy ending available in such a setting, it could never be cheerful in the shallow sense. Too much had been lost for that. The happy ending was this. The fire did not consume them. The disease did not finish them. The crowd outside did not tear them apart. The shelling did not catch them standing. The camp did not become a grave they had feared, and the men who held power over them in the final weeks of the war chose again and again to use that power to preserve life rather than degrade it. For a generation that had been taught to worship force, this may have been the strangest lesson of all, that the strongest men in the camp were the ones who no longer needed to prove themselves through cruelty. Long after the barracks were dismantled, long after uniforms were buried or burned, long after the mud had dried and the road outside carried civilian traffic instead of military columns, the meaning of that place remained with those who had passed through it. They remembered the camp not only as an enclosure of wire and hunger, but as the place where a lie collapsed. The lie that the enemy would always be inhuman. The lie that mercy belonged only to weakness. The lie that war, once total, erased the possibility of decency. In that former German compound, during the broken spring of 1945, those lies met something stronger than fear. They met a line of American soldiers who repaired pumps before they rested, who measured food instead of throwing it, who carried the sick, who guarded prisoners from vengeance, who ran into fire, who dragged enemy bodies out of smoke, who shared blankets in the cold, who pulled defeated men into trenches when shells came too near, and who kept doing such things even after victory no longer required anything of them but administration. That is why the question echoed for so long among the Germans who survived there. Why are the Americans helping us? Because, in the end, that was what separated the world that was dying from the world that might still be built. One world had taught men to sort lives by ideology and usefulness, and to turn institutions into engines of degradation. The other, imperfect and exhausted and stained by its own losses, still insisted that a prisoner was a human being, that order could serve survival, that strength without mercy was only another form of ruin. And so the story ended not with dramatic last shot or a speech over triumphant music, but with something quieter and far more enduring. Gates opening in daylight, men stepping out alive, and behind them a memory of a camp where the enemy they had feared had kept them breathing long enough to see peace. In that sense, the happiest ending war could still offer was given there. Not innocence restored, not history erased, but life returned where death had been expected, dignity preserved where humiliation had been feared, and a truth carried into the ruined future by those who had once believed the opposite. That even behind barbed wire, even in the last ash-filled seas of the war, mercy could survive, and because it survived, so did they.